My name's Jonathan Kennedy. I'm a reader in global health and politics at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at Queen Mary University of London. And I wrote a book called Pathogenesis. It has different subtitles in the US and the UK. In the US, it's 8 Plagues That Made the World. And in the UK, it is How Germs Made History. And basically, this book tries to really transform the way that we think about history. So most people, when we think of the natural world, we just think of it as a stage. You know, if we go back to the Old Testament, you know, when God supposedly created humans in his own image and then gave us dominion over the natural world, over the earth, the sea, and the animals. But you know, the more that we learn about the world that we live in, we realize that we're not living on a stage. We're very much part of a system, a pretty precarious ecosystem in which we play a rather minor role, and in which pathogens and microbes of all sorts play a really, really crucial role, both in the way that the planet functions, but also in the way that our own bodies and even the way that our own minds function. I guess kind of the starting point for the book is if microbes have such a enormous impact on us as individuals, what impact do they have on the body social, the body economic, and the body politic? So what impact do they have on aggregations of bodies, on society, on the whole of human history? And so I kind of start off by looking at the extinction of the Neanderthals 50,000 years ago and whiz through history in about 300 pages, and end up looking at COVID and the future.
Perfect, thank you. And so I assume that your background isn't, you know, like a pure like biology background. I'm just kind of interested what got you first set on like infectious disease as a topic to talk about.
Yeah. So my background is history was my first degree, and my PhD is in sociology. And I suppose I've always been interested in biology. I did biology A level. I ended up teaching in a medical school because I teach public health. And I guess during the COVID pandemic, I started going back over a bit of my kind of A level biology and thinking about what viruses were and what bacteria were, and thinking about how that related to the things that I teach. And I guess I had, you know, quite a revelatory moment, quite a revelation, in the sense that, you know, I really began to realize that, you know, the kind of research that scientists have done over the last 20 years that, you know, talk about the importance of the microbiome, not just on our gut and our gut health, but the increasing amount of evidence that seems to show that the bacteria in our guts are capable of producing neurotransmitters, and that these might be able to influence our minds through the vagal nerve. And it just kind of, it really blew my mind, if you excuse the pun, and really got me thinking about the role that microbes have on the world and on the things that I look at. And I guess the broader context of this was it was happening during the COVID pandemic, and you know, it became a cliche pretty soon to say that this was unprecedented, it was extraordinary. And as someone who has an interest in history, I knew that wasn't the case. I kind of knew that going back, you know, whether we look at the Black Death, or whether we look at the impact that old world pathogens had on the conquest of the Americas, or if we look back at Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, that infectious diseases have played a massive role in history, and they've killed, you know, millions and millions of people at a time. And they'd even brought, you know, whole civilizations crashing down, but they'd also created the space for new ideas and for new societies to emerge. And that, you know, this got me thinking that, you know, really, when we look at it, this is one of the major driving forces of history. You know, we often think about great men and women being the driving force of the history, or if we're on the left, we think about oppressed classes struggling for a better life. But it was really interesting when I started looking at the topic of history through the lens of the pathogen, how you start to see things differently and how it all links up pretty neatly.
Thank you. Just before we kind of go into some of the more of the details in the book, I was wondering if there was any kind of research that led you down like an unexpected path, or was there anything that you hadn't expected when you set out to write the book, and by the end of it, sort of change your perspective on the whole topic?
So, like, one of the really striking things for me as a layperson was reading about retroviruses and the way in which retroviruses could insert their DNA into ours, and if they infect a sperm or an egg, this gets passed down from generation to generation. So scientists talk about something like 8% of the DNA in the human genome coming from these retrovirus infections, and this was mind-blowing enough. But then to realize that there are studies that show that this isn't only junk DNA, that humans seem to have acquired really a variety of capabilities that we often think as being really fundamental to the essence of being human from these viruses. So things like the ability for the placenta to bind to the uterus, or the ability to form memories, the way in which kind of information seems to pass from brain cell to brain cell seems to have been acquired from retrovirus infections. We're taught that kind of the Darwinian idea of evolution through natural selection is just kind of the way that things happen. To start to realize that this kind of this is an important aspect of evolution, but also it wasn't just through kind of these it wasn't just through conflict between and within species that kind of evolution occurred. It was also through like collaboration between our distant ancestors hundreds of millions of years ago and viruses, these kind of things that are neither living nor dead, and that this has created great evolutionary leaps. This really kind of amazed me, and again wanted me to this amazed me and really encouraged me to think more about this topic and how it relates to my own. And the other thing is I hadn't realized it, maybe I wasn't even taught it at school, but the kind of Lynn Margulis work on endosymbiosis, and again the fact that the basic building blocks of complex life, eukaryotic cells, emerged again not from the struggle between or within species, but from this kind of symbiotic union between two single-celled organisms. Again, this got me really thinking so much differently, not just about evolution, but also about the world that we live in today, and the importance of collaboration and working together as a driving force in history.
Thank you. At the start of the book, I was thinking of the way that you were sort of framing this, like, kind of, I guess, it like a different lens of history, I suppose, and it reminded me of the dawn of everything, and then you go on to like specifically refer to it, and I was wondering if you feel that whether like this book is part of maybe like a greater movement of maybe recontextualizing ancient history and how we sort of perceive human behavior in the past and today. I'm just wondering if that was like a conscious thing that you were thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it was at the time. I mean, certainly other books have had a big influence on me. I mean, The Dawn of Everything came out while I was writing the book, and it certainly changed the way I thought about the world, and particularly the way I thought about the Neolithic Revolution. So the point at which humans changed from being hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists, which of course was a boon for pathogens and created a kind of golden age for pathogens that we're still living in. But yeah, certainly I mean, Harari's *Sapiens*. I mean, it's a book that I criticize a bit in my own book, but just to see the scope of what he did and how he tried to condense the history of humanity into a few hundred pages, I think kind of that gave me some inspiration in the sense that I thought I could also have a go at that. I think even looking back to someone like Jared Diamond, you know, I used to, as someone who studied history but also is really interested in the natural world, that also gave me the confidence to kind of take a really multidisciplinary approach to looking at the history. And I think, you know, certainly it's been fantastic to see the success of Wengrow and Graeber and how they kind of, what, New York Times bestseller with basically a big book about the history of archaeology and how that tells us, you know, a lot about the world we live in today. It was certainly, again, it kind of, it helped me. And I think, you know, one thing that I found really surprising when I was doing the research for this book was, again, like how much we now know about ancient pathogens from the study of DNA, and in particular, you know, kind of the work that's been done extracting DNA from really ancient skeletons. And you don't just get human genetic material; you also pick up the microbes that were in the bloodstream at the time of death. And you know, there's a variety of really fascinating studies, but one that really struck me was I forget the author's name, Nicola Raskovan, I think. It was studied in Cell. It was, sorry, Nicola Raskolan, and it was published in Cell about five years ago, and it basically identifies the earliest sign of Yersinia pestis, plague bacteria, and so finds it in the kind of 5,000-year old skeleton of some Swedish people who were buried in a mass tomb. And so when we start to piece all this together, there seems to have been, you know, kind of some kind of catastrophic pandemic across Eurasia caused by plague. And we also know from archaeologists that the population around this time seems to have collapsed, seems to have fallen by about 60% and stayed at that level for 500 years. And we also know from the work of people like David Reich and Samantha Parbo, who look at ancient DNA, that around this time you have a migration of a new genetically distinct group of people who come from somewhere north of the Black Sea and migrate across Europe. And you know, they bring their DNA, but also, it seems, Indo-European languages. And so it really strikes me as crazy that today, you know, kind of we can go outside and look around and listen, and we still see and we still hear the consequences of this Neolithic Black Death that occurred 5,000 years ago. It's crazy stuff.
Thank you. And so a lot of the, a lot of the book is like at the start is obviously about, ancient humans, like prehistoric humans. And then, the latter half, and obviously, especially the end, is, modern day. I kind of just want, I mean, I can kind of guess what your response would be, but imagine, if someone were to say, oh, what's the value of looking, so far in the past at diseases, because obviously, you point out to these like ancient, like Greco-Roman conflicts, and then you follow all the way through to like sort of, there's a part in the book about how the like a Scottish expedition to set up a colony, and the sort of the difficulties they faced with not having immunity kind of led to, like the Scottish independence movement today. I'm just kind of wondering, like, what's kind of your like argument for like why we should be studying and recontextualizing disease, to affect sort of wider human culture and knowledge, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, what answer is just it's just fascinating. I think, it's a really interesting story that overturns the way that a lot of us think about the world, and I think it contains some really important lessons. Even if we go back to, as far as ancient Greece in the 5th century BC, and the story of what happened during the Peloponnese War, and the fact that the city-state of Athens, which was, almost as far as the first written histories, like the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, and this describes this armed conflict between the city-state of Athens and the city-state of Sparta in the 5th century BC. And you have in Athens this kind of marvelous society. It's the time of Socrates, of Hippocrates, of Herodotus, of Thucydides, of Pericles, of Sophocles. More or less any big name that we associate with ancient Greece was living in Athens in the middle of the 5th century BCE. And then Athens went to war with Sparta. Thought it would win, but as Thucydides writes in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the plague of Athens struck, and nothing did Athens more harm than this. It killed about a third of the population, including the army. It killed Pericles, the great general and statesman, and eventually Athens lost the war, and Sparta won. This is the kind of the beginning of the end of this great period of the ancient Greek Enlightenment. And I think there's a lesson there for our own times, in a way, that we shouldn't be too hubristic. In many ways, the success of our own society has created kind of conditions that might bring about its downfall, whether that's AI or climate change or infectious diseases. And certainly it seems like we're living in a new golden age for infectious diseases, right? If you think of the unprecedented population growth, if you think of encroachment on animal habitats, if you think of the industrial scale of factory farming, not to mention the kind of ease in which we can travel across the world really, really quickly. These have all combined to create almost perfect conditions for pathogens to hop the species barrier and spread quickly throughout the population. And so, I think it's important to realize that we haven't conquered infectious diseases. COVID wasn't an aberration. It's likely that maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 years, maybe 30 years, we'll face another similar pandemic. And, it's really important to look back through history and, learn from the best practice, but also learn from the worst mistakes to prepare ourselves in the most effective way possible.
Thank you. It's interesting when you say it's not an aberration, because I there was one section that I thought was quite telling in that I think it was a discussion on a cholera outbreak during the Industrial Revolution, and how there were like attacks and murders of doctors and people, like police trying to enforce lockdowns. And I thought that was kind of it didn't even need the comparison, because it was so close to home in terms of COVID-19, and that was one that was particularly had a parallel. I was wondering, I'm not sure how much you could speak on this, but throughout the book there's like different there's sort of different diagnoses, I guess, of like, where like where do these diseases come from at the time. So in the past it's sort of like, is it from the gods, or like bad air and things like that. I was wondering, was there any sort of sign in the research, in maybe more in more recent events, sort of like maybe the colonial campaigns, like were, say, the Spanish conquistadors in North America, like with how aware were they of having an immune advantage, if that makes sense? Like were they aware of this happening, or like were they able to sort of diagnose that there was something different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly it must have been so bizarre for the conquistadors that, you know, they came to this, you know, to them a new world. And you know, we often underestimate how advanced and how strong some of the civilizations were in the Americas before the European conquest. You know, you have somewhere like you know, take Mesoamerica. You have the Aztecs or the Mexica Empire. It's an empire of maybe 7-8 million people that ranges all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You know, the capital city Tenochtitlan, which I probably pronounced incorrectly, which is on the current site of Mexico City, had a population of something like 250,000 people. So it was 4 times as big as the biggest city in Spain. This was a vast and sophisticated society, and Hernan Cortes came along with 1,000 people and managed to conquer the empire and build kind of new Spain upon its rubble. And you know, certainly the conquistadors at the time, they believed that, you know, they had God on their side. You know, they weren't affected by, for example, smallpox was the first pandemic to hit the Americas, and it killed maybe a third or half of the population. And then you have, you know, kind of pandemic after pandemic that just came, and, you know, it literally decimated the population of the Americas. You see the population falling from 60 million in about 1500 to 6 million a century later. And it's really kind of, you know, in the days before germ theory, you know, the best ways to explain this would be God or you know, kind of racism. Both terrible explanations in my opinion, but certainly I think we can again understand a lot about the contemporary world by realizing how kind of long lasting the legacy of those explanations have been. How you know, kind of Latin America is now, you know, a staunchly Catholic part of the world, and how, you know, kind of racism against indigenous Americans is still a really kind of really big issue in that part of the world.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to address like some of maybe more of the critiques of the book, just specifically
Sure.
one that I saw in a review in Nature.
Okay.
And not to put you on the spot, but
No.
basically, I found it interesting because the reviewer said that the sort of the analysis in the book was maybe born more out of Marxism than microbiology, and that maybe like what you're describing is sort of a series of human struggles where germs and infectious disease plays an incidental role. And I was kind of just interested in seeing how you would respond to that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the book, you know, certainly it looks at history from the perspective of pathogens, infectious diseases, but you know, it would be too simplistic to say that pathogens explain all of history. You know, kind of often they, at a particular point in time, kind of come in on the side of one group or another and play a crucial role. And I think kind of that review in Nature was particularly pointing towards the explanation of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and certainly, I guess, kind of my explanation and what I think is the dominant explanation in history draws really strongly on the work of Bob Brenner, who's a professor of history and sociology at UCLA, and has written several really important articles on this. And there's even a book called the Brenner Debate, where he does a pretty good job of putting down criticisms. But Brenner doesn't really touch on infectious diseases. But the crucial factor, and he does kind of mention this briefly, is that in the middle of the 14th century, you have this catastrophic demographic collapse where 60% of the population of Europe die. All of a sudden, agricultural land is plentiful. Agricultural labor is really scarce, and this creates a kind of crisis in the feudal system. And in England in particular, it triggers a series of events that ends up with the decline of feudalism and the emergence of capitalism. And the thing to remember as well with the Black Death is it wouldn't have been such a problem maybe if it was just one catastrophic pandemic. But you have the second plague striking in 1361 that kills maybe 30% of the population or 20% of the population, and then you have the periodic return of the plague every 20 years or so for a century. And then even after that, you have the return of the plague every now and then. And so the population of the United Kingdom, or the population of England, certainly didn't recover until the 1700s. This was a kind of catastrophic demographic scar that really had a big impact on society and on the struggles that were going on within society.
Thank you. I was wondering, was there did it? I mean, I'm sure it crossed your mind when you were writing the book, but I was wondering if there was ever a first draft that maybe included, like the Irish famine and sort of, or was that too influenced by human behavior? Just wondering, was that is that on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's really, the major challenge with this book in the end was to make it succinct enough that I think people will be happy to pick up and read it and get through it in hopefully not too sorry. The main challenge with writing a book like this that covers the history of the world from 50,000 years ago to present day is to try to keep it reasonably succinct and to try to maintain some kind of narrative flow that makes it reasonably kind of easy to pick up and put down and read. So there's lots of things that I could have included but didn't, and certainly the Irish famine would be one, or the Spanish flu is something that I don't cover in much detail either. But then there's been some fantastic books on the Spanish flu, for example, and so you can't cover everything in a book that tries to cover the history of the world in 300 pages.
Thank you. And yeah, sorry to put you a bit on the hot
No, not at all.
I think just the last question would be, what's next? Are you going to continue down, the germ route? What's your sort of what's your next venture, I suppose?
Oh, I'm not sure. I have to catch up with some sleep, and there's certainly a few articles that I want to write, kind of that spin off from the book. But yeah, I need to have some rest and have a good summer if it ever arrives, and then I can think again. But I'm, as I said before, I teach public health in a medical school, so I'm really interested in this interaction between, on the one hand, the social world of humans and the world of microbes, and how they come together and how they impact each other. So I don't think I'll move too far away from this topic.
Thank you. Maybe on that with your students, I'm interested how how is this like research? How does that affect your like mentorship and the education that you provide, and like does it affect like do you do you dread the future because you presented it very much as it's a when not an if scenario for future like pandemics particularly. So I'm just wondering how that kind of affects how you approach education.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think one of the key conclusions of the book is really that although the advancements there have been in kind of medical technology over the last kind of 50 years have been fantastic. And even if we look at what happened with the development of vaccines during the COVID pandemic, it was absolutely fantastic, almost miraculous, we could say. But I think one of the key take homes from the book is that wasn't on its own enough. If we look at what happened the last couple of years, really see that particular groups suffered much more from the pandemic. They got sick at much higher rates, and they died at much higher rates when they got sick. So people from particularly poor backgrounds, certain minoritized groups. So you have African Americans in the US, Bangladeshis in the UK, and this really points to the fact that you can't just see the pandemic as a virus spreading. You also have to think of it as a virus taking advantage of a habitat that human society has created for that virus to thrive. And so I think the optimistic thing to take home from this is that we can look back to the late 19th century, where kind of politicians in the UK first started to tax the middle classes directly and tax the working classes indirectly to really improve public health by building sewage systems and piping clean water into the cities. And so the past also shows us that visionary politicians are capable of transforming public health and really kind of helping human societies deal with the challenges that pathogens of various sorts create for us. And so I think certainly we can see that the political response in the UK and the US wasn't perfect. The inequalities in societies made the pandemic much worse. So there are some pretty easy gains there, that we can say can really give us cause to be optimistic that we can deal with the next pandemic much better than the one just passed.